Welcome to Lesson 1.2, Selection and Snapping. In this lesson you will learn how to select and deselect objects. You will learn how to use keyboard shortcuts to speed up drawing. You will learn how to use snapping in Vectorworks. And you will learn how to control snaps and the snapping palette. Let's get back to Vectorworks. In this movie we want to look at selecting, we want to look at snapping, and we want to look at keyboard shortcuts and hotkeys that are going to speed up our work. Let's start by looking at selection. You select objects with this tool, the selection tool. When we move near an object, at the moment my cursor has a black arrow with a little tail on it. If you're on a Windows machine, that'll be a white arrow, but it'll still have a little tail. You might also notice there's a little square around my cursor. Tiny square just around the pointy end of the cursor, and a larger light grey square outside of that. When I go near an object, Vectorworks will snap onto that object. If I move my cursor directly onto the object, you'll notice I've lost my little tail. It's become just a white arrowhead. You'll also notice that my object has changed colour. It's got an orange colour to it. This is Vectorworks pre-selection colour. So I haven't selected the object, it's just pre-selected. So I click once, that object is now selected. So I've got blue handles that go all the way around it. If I click away from it, it is deselected and I can't do anything to it. Now selecting is really important in Vectorworks because selecting objects has to occur before we can manipulate them. So before we mirror them, before we rotate them, we have to select them. If I hold my finger on the Shift key, first of all you notice my arrow goes a darker colour. I click on the next object, I now have two objects selected. You'll notice that I've lost my blue handles. I'll come back to that. But you'll notice that I've got two objects selected, and up here on my Object Info palette, two rectangles. That's what it says. So that's one way of selecting multiple objects. Hold the Shift key down and click on those objects. If you would like to deselect an object, use the Shift key again, click on an object you no longer want, and Vectorworks will deselect that object. Click away from everything to deselect everything. You can also deselect everything by double-clicking on the selection tool. Just make sure you come into the drawing area before Vectorworks updates it. So that's how we can deselect our objects. Now you might have noticed that I dragged my cursor. So I clicked and dragged over the first object. As soon as I totally enclose that first object, it highlights. Over the second object, I'm going to be totally over it, or totally enclosing it, and then those two objects will be selected. Now in this case it looks like I've got three objects selected. I've only got two, because if you look at my Object Info palette, it says two rectangles, but when I'm over another object it does look like I've got three, but I haven't. If I hold my Option key down, or Alt key on a Windows machine, and drag my cursor across objects, as soon as I touch them they start becoming pre-selected, and when I let go of my cursor they are selected. So that's a powerful way. If you used to AutoCAD or ArchiCAD, you might notice that you can drag from one direction, it'll do one thing, drag it from the other direction, it'll do something different. Not so with Vectorworks. You have to hold your finger on the Option key and then it'll select all of those objects. And remember, we can shift and click on an object and that will deselect it. If I have an object selected and I shift drag a marquee, the object that is currently selected will be deselected. Just like shifting and clicking on it if it was already selected. That's common and it's actually kind of logical. So that's selection. We can select objects, we can click on them, they highlight. Now let's have a look at keyboard shortcuts. Most commands have a keyboard shortcut on the menu bar. There's some there, there's some there, there's some there. So if you want to know what those keyboard shortcuts are, just have a look to see what you're doing. They will show up. There's a couple I use a lot: group, ungroup, edit group. I use those a lot and I can't select those at the moment because I haven't got anything selected on the screen. If we want to learn the hotkeys for our tools, just leave your cursor over a tool. And it comes up and it says Selection Tool, and there's the X. If I go near another tool, the H. Flyover tool. Number 1 is the text tool. Number 4 is rectangles. Number 2 is the line tool. So it tells you exactly what the hotkey is for those. So let me just try some of those out. I want to draw a rectangle, so I hit key 4, selects the rectangle tool. I hit key X, I go back to the selection tool. Those keyboard shortcuts or those hotkeys will really speed you up a lot. While we're talking about hotkeys, this area here, there are 3 modes here, and then there's a vertical line. Then there's 1 mode in a vertical line, then there are 3 in a vertical line. So that's known as the mode bar group 1, group 2, mode bar group 3, mode bar group 4. Now if we have a look at our keyboard, if we start with the U key, the U does the first group, I does the second group, O does the next group, P does the group after that. And if there's another group, it's the bracket, the open square bracket, and then the closed square bracket. Let's select an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this mode here, the disabled interactive scaling. Now when I do that, it does disable all of the interactive scaling, so I can't stretch that rectangle. In the second mode, I can stretch a single object. I'm just going to undo that. But if I select 2 objects, I can't rescale those. I can't stretch them. If I turn on the third mode, then I can, and when I do that, it will actually stretch both objects. I find this is the safest one to use. I'd like to look at the snapping palette. I'll just drag it out so that it's here. Now I said to you at the beginning that these are the 4 most common snaps, the most useful. But why? Let's turn those off and we'll have a talk about them. So when you have no snaps turned on, you can't snap to a point on an object accurately. This first snap is snap to grid. If I turn that on, I will snap to grid points. Let's just double click on that and we'll have a look at the options. So yes, I can suspend that. Now I tend to use a snapping grid of about 4 inches, 100 millimeters, and a reference grid of around 3 feet 3 inches, or 1 meter. Now in this case it's going to look a little bit strange, but let's just go back with that. I have set my snapping grid to 100 millimeters. That's 100 millimeters on my page. Now it's not very useful. In fact, I suggest you turn off snap to grid, because snap to grid can cause trouble on large projects when you're mirroring and copying. You could accidentally snap to the grid rather than snapping to an object, so turn that off. We can't snap to objects without our object snap. Double click on our object snap, brings up our dialog box again. I think we know that now, that we can hold down the back quote key and we can have a look at this. So we can choose whether we snap to the end point of a line, the midpoint of an edge, or we can turn all of these off and just snap to the end point. And what that means is that it snaps to the top right or the top left, but nowhere in between. So we're going to have center points. I'm going to turn all these back on. When we turn them all back on, we can snap to intersections between things, we can snap to midpoints, we can snap anywhere along the edge, and so on. So it's very useful, this one. I'm going to go back to my line tool now so I can demonstrate the second one here. This is my angle snaps. With angle snaps I can see horizontal, I can see vertical, I can see 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 30 degrees. If I double click on this, I can add a semicolon and I can type in 15 degrees. Now when I draw, I can go 0 degrees, 15, 30, 45, 30, 15, vertical, and so on. If I have a line at an unusual angle or a non-orthogonal angle, and I start here, you'll see that I can draw perpendicular. The word perpendicular just appears. That's a function of the snap. If I turn that off, I can't find perpendicular. Turn it back on, and there's perpendicular. So those two are really quite useful. This is my snap to intersection. There's no options with this one. It's either an intersection or it's not. There it is there, object, object, so it's my intersection. And this last one that I like a lot is the smart cursor. So let's double click on that. So it will create horizontal, vertical, it will create extension lines. We can snap to the line between smart points. And here we've got an option. By default, Vectorworks turns this on. So we can set the datum if the mouse stops for 2 seconds. I like to turn this off. And first of all, I'll show you why I like to turn it off by leaving it on. Okay, so I go to a point here and I'm just a bit slow, and Vectorworks will make that into a datum. The word datum's just appeared. And I'm thinking maybe I could go to that. Oh, now the datum's moved over there. Maybe I want to line up over here somewhere. Oh no, that's my datum. So if I'm a bit slow, it keeps moving my datum around. So let's turn that off. Now I can go to a point like this one. I can hit the G key. That creates a datum. Doesn't matter where I move or how long I'm there, my datum doesn't move. And now all of my coordinates, X, Y, length, and angle, they're all measured relative to my datum point. So they're my cursor location relative to my datum. Even down the bottom here, these coordinates here are also relative to my datum. What does that mean? It means I can go to a point like this one here, hit the G key, and I can go tab, and I want to be, say, 4 inches away, 100 millimeters. And that gives me a line exactly 100 millimeters or 4 inches away from my datum point. And I can go all the way up here, all the way down here. I can go all over the place. So the datum becomes extremely useful. Now, acquire smart points if the mouse stops for half a second. I'm just going to speed that up by going to 0.2 of a second. Now you'll notice that when I go near the end of an object, I'll go back to my line tool, I only have to be there for a short time and I get a little red square. If I move down from that red square, I get a alignment point. If I touch this one, I get an alignment point. Come across there, I get 2 alignment points. So I can actually find the intersection of those 2 alignment points. I can come up here and find that one and that one. So that line starts in line with that point and it finishes in line with that point. It's really useful, this smart cursor. Touch that point, I want to line up there. So if I want to move things around, let's say for example I've got another rectangle and I want to move the edge of this rectangle, line it up with this one, I just have to touch that point and then I come down, they're lined up, I get the little guideline perfectly lined up. So those are my most useful snaps. I'm just going to delete these lines because I don't want them anymore. So that one, you have to have this one, the snap to object. This one's useful, the snap to angle. Intersection is good. So useful, this one. So keep these 4 on all the time. You will speed up your drawing. They do have hotkeys, by the way. So if we go and I change the shape of this, it's much easier for me to remember if I change the shape. So this line here is Q, W, E, and R, A, S, D, F. And if you have a look at your keyboard, those keys actually line up. I don't very often turn those off. I just want to make that that shape. Now if I want to disable snapping, I just hold down my back quote key. It's the key at the top left of your keyboard, and it just turns off all my snaps, and just temporarily let go of that key, they will come back again. I'm going to draw a rectangle on top of everything. So now it's very difficult for me to see my other rectangles underneath. If I hold down the B key, B for behind, I can actually see through it and I can see everything. It's really handy seeing through objects like that. I use it a lot when I'm doing housing projects and I've got roofs that are solid. Hold down the B key, everything goes see-through, you can see right through everything. When I put my cursor at this point here, you might notice that I've got a little asterisk next to my cursor. Hold down the J key and then click, and it brings up this dialog box where I can choose which object I want to snap to, because there's more than one object in that area. Now they may not seem like very useful things, so I'm just going to open a file and show you something that I'm working on. So this is a typical house project. Here's a project I've been working on recently. Now you can see there's a lot going on here. So if I go into an area like this, and I want to select an object here, for example, I need the J key, click, because there's so many things going on here. There's a symbol in that point. If I zoom out like this and I then try to snap, so I hold down the J key and I go click. So there's a rectangle, there's a line, there's a symbol, there's a wall, there's a rectangle, there's a polygon. So there's so many things happening. This is such a useful thing. If I hold down the B key, notice how all of my solid fills have gone see-through. So it's much easier for me to select objects underneath. If I turn my roof on at the same time, now it's impossible to see everything. Hold down the B key, now I can see right through the roof. So these things make it very quick. Let's just go back to my untitled project. One final thing I'd like to look at is I've got a line over here, and I want to use one of these options. It actually said to snap to objects between smart points. So here, snap to line between smart points. So what does that mean? Now I could draw a line from that point to this one here, but I don't need to, because Vectorworks will give me this little grey area here that is exactly halfway between those two red dots. Click, and now I can draw half of that, or I can draw somewhere completely different. So there's the start, that's the other point, and that's exactly halfway. And you can see it divides it halfway again, and halfway again, and halfway again, and so on. Just carries on going. So that is an introduction to selection and snapping in keyboard shortcuts. This is the end of lesson 1.2. In this lesson you learned how to select and deselect objects. You learned how to use keyboard shortcuts to speed up drawing. You learned how to use snapping in Vectorworks. And you learned how to control snaps and the snapping palette.